It's also interesting for me coming back to sort of, think about this. I mean, I had a read of it, this weekend. It's 3 years or so, at least 3 years since I actually wrote it. And, I couldn't remember anything about it almost. So
that's very consoling, isn't it?
And I suppose coming back to it, I thought, well, there's some things that I, kind of quite like about it, and some things that, seem terrible to me now. Part of it was, it's incredibly complicated, and I was sort of, reading it, thinking, God, what the hell's happening here? Who are these characters? How do they all kind of link up? What's happening here? How am I going to ever kind of explain sort of, what's going on? At the same time, I sort of, not to blow my own trumpet, but I think it was intriguing as well. There were sort of, kind of links and connections between the disparate sort of plots that sort of, did, sort of, reading it back, sort of, have me intrigued and thinking, well, yes, these elements do connect up to some extent. And I think sort of, what I didn't want to do was to try and, to come up with a plot or a story. I mean, detective stories are essentially sort of plot-driven things. And I didn't want to produce a story that was so straightforward and so kind of transparent from the outset that anyone reading this would have a clear sense of what was happening from the word go. I wanted that sense of confusion, I suppose, in the kind of readers initially. So there would be that sort of sense of people not necessarily working it in the same way that you work at a kind of, a literary novel, but working it insofar as trying to kind of figure out how these different elements might link together, I suppose. So I didn't really want to make it sort of, that easy or that straightforward. You obviously have the sort of sensation novels of the mid-Victorian period by writers like kind of Wilkie Collins, particularly sort of kind of shining a light into the kind of dark corners of the domestic worlds. And then later in the Victorian sort of era, you have the arrival of Sherlock Holmes and other kind of detective stories for the first time. So obviously there's a kind of huge amount of sort of raw material there for, kind of contemporary novelists to deal with. And of course there's Dickens, who stands above it all, sort of, as the sort of, as the most significant figure. So I suppose sort of, what does the contemporary novelist do in relation to all of this? I mean, my worry was, I really didn't want to get into a kind of notion of trying to imitate these sort of figures. That would be absolute folly. So I didn't want to sort of try and produce a kind of cod Dickensian sort of narrative, because, Dickens is such a sort of fantastic writer, and to try and sort of, somehow imitate or copy, his sentence structures, the richness of his language seemed to be kind of absolute folly. And because I don't come from that world, I probably wouldn't be able to do it anyway. I mean, there are certain contemporary writers who have made a goodish effort, I think, of doing that. One particularly who comes to mind is someone called D.J. Taylor, who's written a number of novels, but this one called Kept that sort of, is most striking in my memory. And I think sort of he believes that it's sort of possible to kind of recreate this world if you, kind of can reimagine the language in certain ways. And, fair play to him, but that's not what I wanted to do. I certainly wanted to use a contemporary idiom to describe this sort of, this Victorian world. And one of the thrills, one of the challenges was to recreate this sort of the sort of the squalor and the stench of this world in as vivid as way as possible. And I suppose sort of just read a brief passage from the beginning of this novel that perhaps sort of kind of gives a sense of the sort of the difference of this kind of world. So it's Pike going to the Ratcliff Highway for the first time. As he moved along the Ratcliff Highway from east to west, tramping between brothels, slop shops, taverns, pawnbrokers, gin palaces and beer shops, past vendors selling pies, chestnuts, gingerbread and baked potatoes, he didn't feel exactly unsafe, but he did make a point of not catching anyone else's eye unnecessarily. He also kept the purse he'd been given by Tilling closer to his body. It was a warm, early spring afternoon, but the weather did nothing to improve the Ratcliff Highway. It had always felt like the kind of place where someone might slit your belly as easily as shake your hand. The pavements were full, but mainly of faces that were alien to Pike. Lascar and Malay sailors with their dark skin and tear-shaped eyes, bearded Jews hawking piles of old clothes, German and Scandinavian stevedores, recognisable by their uniform, biding their time before their ships sailed for home, and black dockers who could carry a hogshead of sugar on their shoulders. There were children too, bow-legged, malnourished, running alongside the wagons and drays barefoot. Everyone was going about their business, but Pike couldn't help but feel that people had noticed him, noticed that he was different, that he didn't belong there. Even as a Bow Street runner, he'd rarely ventured to this part of the city. A runner who had tried to serve a warrant on a tavern landlord here had been dragged out onto the street and kicked to death. Pike couldn't say with any conviction that this was either the poorest or indeed the most dangerous part of the city. St Giles and parts of Shadwell or Rotherhithe came close, but it was undoubtedly the street whose reputation cast the greatest terror into the hearts of most Londoners. So again, it's sort of trying to give some sense of what that sort of, what that place might have been like. But I suppose there's that notion that sort of, the figure that I've created is essentially a sort of, kind of a hard-boiled detective, kind of who might, sort of in some ways resemble, someone, created by Dashiell Hammett, or sort of, kind of more contemporary figures like sort of Ian Rankin's Inspector Rebus. But sort of taking this figure and sort of, kind of putting him back into a different historical kind of epoch, one where the sort of, the kind of the strictures and the rules and the laws surrounding him would be that much more kind of bounded and circumscribed. So kind of creating a kind of a world where sort of, the forces, the pressures on these kind of individuals would be that much more sort of, significant and less room to maneuver in a certain ways. But then creating this almost sort of cartoonish character, in terms of who is able to do things that other people aren't able to do, but sort of placing back into this context of a very bounded, circumscribed, and then sort of exploring the resulting sort of tensions, I suppose. So in some ways, the novels reflect on the historical period that they're written about. In other ways, they reflect on hard-boiled crime writing more generally, and those kind of issues, perhaps that sort of, kind of you were talking about in relation to other contemporary sort of crime writers whose figures are always on just about the right side of the law, whereas Pike isn't in a sense, and that was something that I was definitely interested in sort of exploring.